Hello and welcome, dear listeners. We're so grateful to have you with us today. Your presence and support are what make it possible for us to share these powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and hidden truths. If you find yourself drawn into tales where lies unravel and the truth always finds its way to the surface, be sure to subscribe to our channel. That way, you'll never miss the next story we bring to life. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because today's story is one you won't forget. I gave her my kidney. 2 weeks later, she gave me divorce papers. And within 24 hours, the man she married would be begging for mercy. That's not the kind of line you expect to hear at the start of a love story. But then again, this isn't a love story anymore. It's a story about sacrifice, betrayal, and what happens when devotion is answered with cruelty. His name was Daniel Harper. A man in his early 40s, quiet but strong, the kind of husband who built his life around the promise he made at the altar, in sickness and in health. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't rich, but he was steady. Steady in his work as a logistics manager, steady in his marriage to a woman he thought was the love of his life, and steady in his role as father to their teenage son, Luke. Daniel met Claire, his wife, almost 20 years earlier at a friend's cookout. She was magnetic in a way that made rooms shift when she entered. Sharp-witted, ambitious, full of energy. Daniel, more reserved, was drawn to her brightness. Where he was measured, she was bold. Where he was patient, she was impulsive. It wasn't a perfect fit, but Daniel believed that balance was the secret to lasting love. And for many years, it seemed to work. Their life wasn't extraordinary, but it was theirs. They had a modest home in the suburbs, 2 cars that ran well enough, and a rhythm of family dinners, little league games, and summer barbecues with neighbors. By every outward appearance, they were just another ordinary couple. Daniel didn't need more. He believed he had everything he could ever want. But then came the diagnosis. Claire's health began to decline slowly at first. Fatigue, weight loss, unexplained pain. The tests confirmed what Daniel had prayed against. Her kidneys were failing. Dialysis was buying her time, but not much. The doctors explained that her best chance at survival would be a transplant. And so began the desperate search for a match. Family was tested. Friends volunteered. Weeks dragged into months, hope dimmed each time results came back negative. Until finally, the answer came from the most unexpected place. Daniel himself. It was rare, the doctors said, for a spouse to be a compatible match, but Daniel's blood work lined up almost perfectly with Claire's. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to consider the risks to himself, the complications, the long recovery. He signed the papers, prepared for surgery, and told Claire with unwavering conviction, "If this is what it takes to keep you alive, then I'll do it." The operation was grueling, but successful. Daniel woke in pain, his body weakened from the surgery, but his heart lightened by one thought: he had saved his wife's life. When Claire was wheeled into his recovery room the next day, she was pale and exhausted but alive. She smiled faintly at him, whispered, "Thank you," and drifted back to sleep. Daniel, in that moment, believed their love had been sealed with the ultimate sacrifice. Recovery was harder than he expected. The doctors had warned him, but nothing prepared him for the exhaustion that clung to him like a weight. Every movement tugged at stitches, every step was an effort. Nights were restless, haunted by pain, and days blurred into one another. But through it all, Daniel held onto one truth. His suffering was temporary, hers had been permanent, until he gave her a second chance. In those first 2 weeks, he imagined the life they would rebuild together. Maybe this crisis would be the catalyst to renew their marriage. Maybe Claire would see how deeply he loved her, how far he was willing to go to protect her. He dreamed of vacations they would finally take, of celebrating anniversaries with gratitude instead of routine, of telling their son one day that their marriage had endured the ultimate test. But the fantasy shattered with a single envelope. It was a gray morning, rain tapping lightly against the hospital window. Daniel had just managed to stand long enough to shuffle to the small chair by his bed, his muscles trembling with the effort. A knock at the door startled him. A woman in a crisp suit entered, briefcase in hand. She asked his name, confirmed it with a glance at her folder, and handed him a stack of papers. "Mr. Harper," she said flatly. "You've been served." Confused, Daniel took the documents in shaky hands. He scanned the first page, the words blurring until one phrase snapped into focus: petition for dissolution of marriage. His breath caught. He read it again, slower this time, as if disbelief had made him misinterpret it. But no, it was real. Divorce papers. Filed by his wife, Claire, less than 2 weeks after he'd given her a piece of his body to save her life. His first thought wasn't anger. It was numbness. A hollow coldness that spread from his chest outward, leaving him too stunned to speak. He looked at the attorney, hoping for some kind of explanation, but she simply nodded politely and left. Alone, Daniel turned each page with trembling fingers. Legal jargon, division of assets, custody considerations for Luke. The words felt surreal, like some cruel prank. But the signature at the bottom was undeniably hers. Claire Harper. His wife. The woman he had nearly died to save. Daniel sat frozen in that chair, staring at the papers until the rain outside turned to a storm. Questions swirled in his mind, crashing one against another. But had she been planning this all along? Was the surgery just a means to an end? Had the love he believed in been dead long before he ever went under the knife? Every detail replayed in his mind, her distant expressions in the weeks before surgery, the forced gratitude afterward, the faint smile that now felt like mockery. And then a sharper memory, her phone calls with hushed tones when she thought he was asleep, her sudden secrecy about finances, her insistence on separate recovery spaces after they left the hospital. Signs he'd brushed aside, blinded by devotion. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was physical. His body bore the scar, a constant reminder of the kidney he no longer had. And now she was cutting out the rest of him, their marriage, their family, their life together. Daniel closed the folder, placed it on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in his life, he felt truly hollow. He had given everything, and in return, she had given him nothing but abandonment. And yet, as he lay there in the quiet storm of betrayal, a single thought began to crystallize in his mind. A thought not born of despair, but of clarity. If she wanted to end their marriage, so be it. But it would not be on her terms. The storm outside had passed by morning, but inside Daniel Harper, it raged on. The divorce papers still sat unopened on the nightstand, though he had read them so many times he could recite entire paragraphs. Each clause carved deeper into the wound. The words weren't just legal, they were final. And yet, Claire hadn't spoken a word to him since serving them. No explanation. No confrontation. Not even the courtesy of anger. Just silence, like their 20-year marriage had been nothing more than an administrative inconvenience. That silence was what broke Daniel more than the papers. He needed to hear it from her own mouth. He needed to understand why. The confrontation came 2 days later, when Daniel was discharged from the hospital. He was still weak, leaning heavily on a cane, his body aching with each step. His friend Mark drove him home. Mark had been by his side since college, loyal, loud, and fiercely protective. Where Daniel was measured, Mark was blunt. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mark asked as he pulled into the driveway. "I don't have a choice," Daniel replied, his voice flat. "She's still my wife. For now." Claire was waiting. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, her posture rigid. The house smelled faintly of antiseptic from her own recovery, but she looked radiant, glowing with health. His kidney had restored her vitality. The irony was cruel. "Why, Claire?" Daniel's voice cracked as he steadied himself against the wall. "You couldn't wait? Not even until I healed." Her eyes met his, cold and detached, as though she were addressing a stranger. "Because I don't love you anymore, Daniel. I haven't for a long time." The words cut sharper than any scalpel. He had braced for excuses, maybe anger, maybe guilt. But her tone was clinical, devoid of emotion. "You could have told me before," he said quietly. "Before the surgery. Before I—" His hand brushed against the scar beneath his shirt. Claire's lips twitched, almost a smirk. "Would it have changed anything? You would have done it anyway. Because that's who you are. Always the martyr." Daniel staggered as though she'd slapped him. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg her to reconsider, but he stopped himself. In her indifference, he saw the truth. Nothing he said would matter. "You've made your choice," he said finally. "So have I." Back at his recovery apartment, a small place Mark had helped him rent so he wouldn't have to share the house, Daniel picked up the phone and dialed. Not to plead with Claire, but to seek counsel. "Leona Fisk speaking," came the crisp voice on the other end. Leona was more than an attorney, she was a legend in their city's legal circles. Known for her sharp suits, sharper tongue, and reputation for never losing high-stakes divorce cases, she was both feared and respected. "It's Daniel Harper," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need your services immediately." There was a pause. "Daniel? I thought you weren't back from the hospital yet." Plans changed. He inhaled deeply. "Can you meet today?" "For you? Absolutely. My office 2 hours." When Daniel arrived at Leona's sleek downtown office, she studied him for a long moment. He looked pale, exhausted, but there was something in his eyes she recognized: resolve. "You waited until after you saved her life to file divorce," she said after he explained everything. "That's cold, even by my standards." "I need to know what I'm dealing with," Daniel replied. "And I need options." Leona leaned back, steepling her fingers. "First things first. Did she tell you why?" "She said she doesn't love me anymore. That's it. No explanation, no apology." "That's not the whole story," Leona said firmly. "No one files this quickly unless they're motivated by more than feelings." She pulled a legal pad closer. "We'll need to look at accounts, property, her movements during your recovery. Affairs, financial transfers, anything unusual. You said you noticed phone calls, secrecy?" Daniel nodded grimly. "Good. That's where we start. In the meantime, I'll draft an injunction to freeze joint assets. If she tries to drain accounts or move money, she'll be blocked. Consider it your first win." That night, Daniel sat in his apartment, exhaustion pressing down on him. He tried to sleep, but his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Mark. "You need to see this." Attached were screenshots. Social media posts, tagged photos. Claire, just days after surgery, smiling in restaurants, shopping downtown, not with girlfriends, but with a man. A tall figure with expensive taste, always at her side. Daniel's pulse quickened. He zoomed in. Same man, different outfits, but unmistakably the same. At first, he told himself it could be innocent, maybe a friend, maybe a business contact. But then came the photo that ended all doubt. Claire leaning into him, his arm wrapped comfortably around her waist. Not the tentative touch of new lovers, but the intimacy of something long established. Mark's message followed. "He's been seen at your house. Multiple times. Neighbors say he's there almost every night." Daniel set the phone down carefully, forcing his breathing steady. Proof. Not speculation, not paranoia. Proof. Claire hadn't just stopped loving him. She had replaced him. The next morning, Daniel sat across from Leona again. He slid the phone across the desk. "Her. With him." Leona scanned the photos, her expression cool but sharp. "Interesting. He looks familiar." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "I'll have my investigator run him through databases. In the meantime, the injunction is filed. She can't move large sums without alerting us." It was a small victory, but Daniel clung to it. His marriage might be collapsing, his body might be weakened, but at least he wasn't powerless. Not anymore. Leona glanced up. "Do you want me to initiate divorce proceedings from your side? Counterfile, contest custody, push leverage?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. She wanted this war. But I won't fight blind. I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with first." Leona smiled faintly. "Good. You're not the first betrayed spouse I've seen, Daniel, but I have to say, you're one of the calmest. That unnerves people. Use it." That night, Mark came by with takeout. He studied his friend carefully as they ate in silence. Finally, he said, "You're taking this better than I expected." Daniel didn't look up. "I'm not taking it better. I'm just taking it differently." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" I'm done reacting. I'll respond. On my terms. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Mark nodded slowly. All right, just don't shut me out. You're not alone in this. Daniel gave the faintest smile. I know. And I'll need you before this is done. Days later, the investigator's report landed on Leona's desk. She called Daniel immediately. I have news, she said, her tone measured. About the man. Daniel's heart pounded as he sat forward. Leona paused for emphasis. The man your wife left you for wasn't just any stranger. He was someone closer than you could imagine. The storm outside had passed by morning, but inside Daniel Harper, it raged on. The divorce papers still sat unopened on the nightstand, though he had read them so many times he could recite entire paragraphs. Each clause carved deeper into the wound. The words weren't just legal, they were final. And yet, Claire hadn't spoken a word to him since serving them. No explanation. No confrontation. Not even the courtesy of anger. Just silence, like their 20-year marriage had been nothing more than an administrative inconvenience. That silence was what broke Daniel more than the papers. He needed to hear it from her own mouth. He needed to understand why. The confrontation came 2 days later, when Daniel was discharged from the hospital. He was still weak, leaning heavily on a cane, his body aching with each step. His friend Mark drove him home. Mark had been by his side since college, loyal, loud, and fiercely protective. Where Daniel was measured, Mark was blunt. Are you sure you're ready for this? Mark asked as he pulled into the driveway. I don't have a choice, Daniel replied, his voice flat. She's still my wife. For now. Claire was waiting. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, her posture rigid. The house smelled faintly of antiseptic from her own recovery, but she looked radiant, glowing with health. His kidney had restored her vitality. The irony was cruel. Why, Claire? Daniel's voice cracked as he steadied himself against the wall. You couldn't wait? Not even until I healed. Her eyes met his, cold and detached, as though she were addressing a stranger. Because I don't love you anymore, Daniel. I haven't for a long time. The words cut sharper than any scalpel. He had braced for excuses, maybe anger, maybe guilt. But her tone was clinical, devoid of emotion. You could have told me before, he said quietly. Before the surgery. His hand brushed against the scar beneath his shirt. Claire's lips twitched, almost a smirk. Would it have changed anything? You would have done it anyway. Because that's who you are. Always the martyr. Daniel staggered as though she'd slapped him. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg her to reconsider, but he stopped himself. In her indifference, he saw the truth. Nothing he said would matter. You've made your choice, he said finally. So have I. Back at his recovery apartment, a small place Mark had helped him rent so he wouldn't have to share the house, Daniel picked up the phone and dialed. Not to plead with Claire, but to seek counsel. Leona Fisk speaking, came the crisp voice on the other end. Leona was more than an attorney, she was a legend in their city's legal circles. Known for her sharp suits, sharper tongue, and reputation for never losing high-stakes divorce cases, she was both feared and respected. It's Daniel Harper, he said, his voice low but steady. I need your services immediately. There was a pause. Daniel? I thought you weren't back from the hospital yet. Plans changed. He inhaled deeply. Can you meet today? For you? Absolutely. My office 2 hours. When Daniel arrived at Leona's sleek downtown office, she studied him for a long moment. He looked pale, exhausted, but there was something in his eyes she recognized, resolve. You waited until after you saved her life to file divorce, she said after he explained everything. That's cold, even by my standards. I need to know what I'm dealing with, Daniel replied. And I need options. Leona leaned back, steepling her fingers. First things first. Did she tell you why? She said she doesn't love me anymore. That's it. No explanation, no apology. That's not the whole story, Leona said firmly. No one files this quickly unless they're motivated by more than feelings. She pulled a legal pad closer. We'll need to look at accounts, property, her movements during your recovery. Affairs, financial transfers, anything unusual. You said you noticed phone calls, secrecy? Daniel nodded grimly. Good. That's where we start. In the meantime, I'll draft an injunction to freeze joint assets. If she tries to drain accounts or move money, she'll be blocked. Consider it your first win. That night, Daniel sat in his apartment, exhaustion pressing down on him. He tried to sleep, but his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Mark. You need to see this. Attached were screenshots. Social media posts, tagged photos. Claire, just days after surgery, smiling in restaurants, shopping downtown, not with girlfriends, but with a man. A tall figure with expensive taste, always at her side. Daniel's pulse quickened. He zoomed in. Same man, different outfits, but unmistakably the same. At first, he told himself it could be innocent, maybe a friend, maybe a business contact. But then came the photo that ended all doubt. Claire leaning into him, his arm wrapped comfortably around her waist. Not the tentative touch of new lovers, but the intimacy of something long established. Mark's message followed. He's been seen at your house. Multiple times. Neighbors say he's there almost every night. Daniel set the phone down carefully, forcing his breathing steady. Proof. Not speculation, not paranoia. Proof. Claire hadn't just stopped loving him. She had replaced him. The next morning, Daniel sat across from Leona again. He slid the phone across the desk. Her. With him. Leona scanned the photos, her expression cool but sharp. Interesting. He looks familiar. She tapped her pen against her notepad. I'll have my investigator run him through databases. In the meantime, the injunction is filed. She can't move large sums without alerting us. It was a small victory, but Daniel clung to it. His marriage might be collapsing, his body might be weakened, but at least he wasn't powerless. Not anymore. Leona glanced up. Do you want me to initiate divorce proceedings from your side? Counterfile, contest custody, push leverage. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. She wanted this war. But I won't fight blind. I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with first. Leona smiled faintly. Good. You're not the first betrayed spouse I've seen, Daniel, but I have to say, you're one of the calmest. That unnerves people. Use it. That night, Mark came by with takeout. He studied his friend carefully as they ate in silence. Finally, he said, You're taking this better than I expected. Daniel didn't look up. I'm not taking it better. I'm just taking it differently. Mark frowned. What do you mean? I mean I'm done reacting. I'll respond. On my terms. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Mark nodded slowly. All right, just don't shut me out. You're not alone in this. Daniel gave the faintest smile. I know. And I'll need you before this is done. Days later, the investigator's report landed on Leona's desk. She called Daniel immediately. I have news, she said, her tone measured. About the man. Daniel's heart pounded as he sat forward. Leona paused for emphasis. The man your wife left you for wasn't just any stranger. He was someone closer than you could imagine. The longer Daniel studied the clip of Ethan walking casually out of his house, the colder the air around him felt. A stranger breaking in would have triggered alarms, but this wasn't a stranger. Ethan moved like a man who belonged there. Like someone who had been granted access. Claire's key. Daniel tucked the phone away, not trusting himself to say what he was thinking. But when Mark called an hour later, Daniel didn't hesitate. I need more than photos, Daniel said. His voice was steady, but underneath it was a current his old friend recognized immediately. You want me to dig deeper? Not just you. I need someone who can do this cleanly. Someone who knows how to look where others don't. There was silence on the line, then Mark sighed. I know a guy. Used to be Intel. Runs his own PI outfit now. Expensive but worth every cent. Set it up. The next afternoon, Daniel sat in a booth at a small diner off the interstate. Across from him was Harris Bentley, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a notebook so worn it looked like it had survived a dozen deployments. Harris didn't waste time on pleasantries. Mark says you need eyes on a man and a woman. Affairs aren't my favorite work, but what he described doesn't sound like your average affair. It isn't, Daniel said. He slid the photos of Claire and Ethan across the table, followed by the clip of Ethan entering his house. I want to know everything. Where they go, what they say, who else they're tied to. And I need it soon. Harris studied the images, then looked up. You're not just trying to catch them cheating. You want leverage. I want the truth, Daniel corrected. Harris gave a thin smile. Same thing in my line of work. He closed the notebook. Give me a week. The waiting was worse than the surgery. At least in the hospital, Daniel had been surrounded by machines, doctors, and the illusion of control. Now, every hour felt like a wound he couldn't stop reopening. He filled the silence with lists, bank accounts, Luke's school schedules, insurance policies, but each line ended in the same thought. She walked out with my life still stitched back together. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel stood shirtless before the bathroom mirror. The scar ran like a pale seam across his abdomen, still tender, still angry. He pressed his palm against it, not hard enough to hurt but enough to remember. That scar should have been proof of love, the price he'd willingly paid to keep Claire alive. Instead, it felt like a signature on his own erasure. His sacrifice hadn't saved their marriage, it had freed her to leave. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was physical. His body bore the evidence. He leaned heavily on the sink, staring at himself, and whispered, "You gave her life. She gave you nothing." For the first time since the papers arrived, the numbness broke. Not into rage, not yet, but into grief so heavy it doubled him over. He sank to the tile, clutching the scar with both hands, and let the storm move through him. By morning, the grief hardened. He showered, dressed, and reminded himself, pain was data. He could work with data. Harris's first report came 5 days later. A manila envelope slid across the diner table. Inside were photos, transcripts, and a summary written in meticulous shorthand. First, your instincts were right, Harris said. They're not just romantically involved. They're planning something bigger. Financial. Legal. Both. Daniel flipped through the pages. Surveillance photos showed Claire and Ethan meeting in cafes, slipping into hotel lobbies, leaving his house late at night. But it wasn't the intimacy that made his chest tighten. It was the paperwork Harris had photographed through zoom lenses. Claire's handwriting on forms, Ethan's laptop screen displaying spreadsheets, notations about property values. They've been meeting with a realtor, Harris continued. Your house is already listed discreetly through one of Ethan's shell contacts. They're framing it as a quick sale to simplify divorce proceedings. If it closes, you'll be cut out of equity entirely unless your injunction sticks. Daniel swallowed hard. His house. The walls where Luke had taken his first steps. The porch where he and Claire had celebrated their 10th anniversary with takeout and laughter. And now it was just another asset on a list. That's not all, Harris said. He pulled out another sheet. I tapped into Ethan's work email cache. He's been consulting with a family law attorney. Custody angles. He's coaching Claire to claim you're unfit, unstable after surgery, unable to provide consistent care. Daniel stared at the words, his jaw tightening. They were already plotting to take Luke. They're moving fast, Harris added. My guess? They want this done before anyone looks too closely at their relationship timeline. If the affair is exposed before the divorce finalizes, it undermines her position. They know it. Daniel closed the folder carefully. He felt the scar pull beneath his shirt, as if reminding him that wounds don't heal overnight. But now the wound had purpose. That night, Daniel sat alone on his balcony, the folder open on his lap. The city lights stretched out like stars, indifferent to his pain. He thumbed through the photos one by one, Claire's hand on Ethan's arm, Ethan whispering something that made her laugh, the two of them studying property documents like business partners. His chest tightened, but not with despair. With clarity. She didn't just betray me. She's trying to erase me. The thought crystallized, cold and certain. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. It was about survival. About whether his son would grow up knowing his father had fought, or believing his father had been too weak to matter. He took a deep breath, let the city air fill his lungs, and whispered to himself, "Not on her terms. Never on her terms." The next morning, Leona called. The injunction held. "She tried to move funds from your joint account yesterday. Bank flagged it. She's furious. Her lawyer called me twice." "Good," Daniel said simply. "There's more," Leona added. "I've reviewed Harris's material. Ethan's fingerprints are all over this. He's guiding her moves, probably because she trusts him more than she trusts her own counsel. That's sloppy. We can use it." Daniel listened in silence, then asked, "What's their next step?" "From what we can tell, they're preparing to file an emergency motion for temporary custody, claiming you're too unstable to parent effectively while you recover. It's thin, but if a judge buys it, they could establish precedent." For a moment, the line was quiet. Then Daniel said, "So they're not just stealing my marriage. They're trying to steal my son." Leona's voice sharpened. "Then we'll make sure they fail." That night, Harris sent one last text. "Surveillance confirms. They're meeting tomorrow to finalize documents. Realtor plus attorney both attending. Midtown office, 3 p.m. You'll want to see this." Daniel stared at the message, the scar beneath his shirt burning like a brand. Every move they made pushed the stakes higher, but also revealed more threads to pull. He set the phone down, his hand trembling, not from weakness, but from restraint. They thought they were orchestrating a clean exit. They thought his sacrifice had been the ticket that freed them both. But what they didn't understand was that Daniel wasn't finished yet. The man who had given his wife life-saving surgery was about to watch her and her lover put the final pieces of their betrayal into place. Selling the house. Draining the accounts. Filing for custody. And Daniel Harper was preparing for war. Harris Bentley didn't look like a man easily shaken, but when he called Daniel the following evening, there was an edge in his voice Daniel hadn't heard before. "Meet me at the office," Harris said. "Bring Leona." An hour later, Daniel sat in the same conference room where weeks earlier he'd first laid divorce papers on the table. Leona was already there, flipping through a thick folder Harris had dropped in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in her jawline gave her away. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Harris leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You wanted everything on Ethan Ward." I dug further into his background. Pulled email threads, financial records, and cross-referenced his hospital access logs. What I found isn't just an affair. It's a conspiracy. Daniel felt the words sink like stone. Harris opened the folder. Inside were printouts, emails between Claire and Ethan, time-stamped weeks before Daniel's surgery. They weren't just seeing each other before the transplant, Harris said. They were planning what came after. Daniel picked up one of the pages, his scar pulling uncomfortably as he leaned forward. The email was short but devastating. "Once the surgery is behind us, we'll be free to move on everything we've discussed. Survivorship rights, trust structures, the Northcrest property. He won't fight you, he never does." It was signed with Ethan's initials. Daniel's throat went dry. Behind us. He had been lying in a hospital bed, prepping to give her his kidney, while she was mapping out how to carve him out of his own life. Leona spoke quietly, as if sensing how close he was to breaking. "They've been researching survivorship rights. In other words, what happens to joint property if one spouse dies? And trust funds, how to shift assets out of reach during separation. These aren't just conversations about leaving a marriage. They're conversations about erasing you from every legal document that matters." Daniel swallowed hard. "While I was bedridden." "Yes," Harris said. "The timing is deliberate. They knew the surgery carried risks. If something had gone wrong in that operating room, every single thing you've built, your home, your savings, even your pension, would have defaulted to her. And Ethan was already planning how to step into that vacuum." The scar across Daniel's abdomen throbbed like it remembered every cut of the surgeon's knife. Leona flipped to the next document. "This is worse. They filed preliminary paperwork to block your access to joint assets. If it goes through, you'll be frozen out. Accounts, property, even rights to contest certain trusts. You have 7 days before a judge signs it." Daniel sat back in his chair. The world seemed smaller, air thinner. 7 days. Yes, Leona said. We're on a clock now. For a long moment, silence hung in the room. Daniel's mind flashed with images. Claire laughing at Ethan in hotel lobbies, Ethan holding the folio of his insurance papers, Luke's face when he asked if his father was coming back home. All of it converged into one sharp point of clarity. I won't fight her physically, Daniel said at last. His voice was steady, deliberate. That's not who I am. That's not what Luke needs to see. But I'll win in ways she doesn't expect. Leona's eyes narrowed, measuring him. Then we need to use every advantage. Paper trails. Timelines. Intent. If we prove collusion, especially during your surgery, a judge will see through their strategy. Harris leaned forward. And Daniel, there's more. Ethan's hospital access logs. He entered restricted file storage the night before your surgery. 32 minutes unaccounted for. I can't prove what he took, but it lines up with when your insurance folio went missing. Daniel's jaw clenched. He used my own surgery as cover. Leona nodded slowly. That's the story we build. The sympathetic soldier, husband, father, sacrificing himself to save his wife. And she, conspiring with another man to profit from that sacrifice. Judges don't ignore betrayal that blatant. Daniel exhaled, long and slow. The pain in his scar didn't fade, but it sharpened into fuel. Every throb was a reminder. He'd given Claire life. She tried to turn it into his death sentence. No more silence. No more reaction. From this moment forward, every move would be deliberate. Then we start now, Daniel said. 7 days. That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. The folder lay open on the table, documents scattered like wreckage. He traced a finger along the margin of one email, the word survivorship underlined in Ethan's careful notes. His stomach turned. Survivorship. The language of wills, of funerals, of endings. He was never supposed to see these words. He was supposed to be gone. He pressed his hand against his scar again, this time not in grief but in defiance. The wound wasn't just a reminder of loss, it was proof he had survived. Proof that their plan had failed. Luke's face came to mind again. His son's quiet anger at both parents, the confusion of a boy too young to understand betrayal but old enough to feel its sting. Daniel couldn't let him grow up believing his father was erased without a fight. This wasn't just about assets. It was about identity, about legacy. The clock was ticking. 7 days. The next morning, Daniel called Mark. They thought the surgery was the end of me, Daniel said, his voice low but charged. But it was just the beginning. Mark didn't ask for details. He simply said, "Tell me what you need." The clock was running, the trap was set, and the stakes had never been higher. In 7 days, Claire and Ethan believed they would strip Daniel of everything that made him who he was. But they'd forgotten one thing. He was still alive. And Daniel Harper had no intention of going quietly. By the end of the week, Daniel's small apartment looked less like a recovery space and more like a war room. The kitchen table was buried beneath folders, photographs, and highlighted transcripts. Harris's reports stacked in neat piles on one side. Leona's legal drafts spread across the other. In between sat Daniel, notebook open, scar aching with every breath but his mind sharper than it had been in months. It was time to stop reacting. Time to set the trap. Hospital logs, he said, tapping a page. Ethan entered restricted archives the night before your surgery. 32 minutes unaccounted for. We don't know what he took, but your missing folio lines up exactly. Next came the emails. Printed exchanges between Ethan and Claire, dates circled in red. Survivorship rights, trust protections, timeline after transplant. Not just an affair, Harris explained. It's premeditated financial fraud. They weren't waiting to see how the surgery went. They were preparing to benefit either way. Leona added her stack, bank transfers. Claire opened a separate account 2 months before surgery. Regular deposits. Gifts. Ward's name doesn't appear, but the source accounts connect to his shell companies. That's marital misconduct and traceable fraud. Judges don't like being lied to. Daniel studied the evidence in silence. Photo after photo. Claire and Ethan in restaurants, Ethan at his house with a key. The spreadsheet where Ethan had written out possible custody strategies. This isn't just betrayal, Leona said finally. It's conspiracy. We frame it that way, and no court will hand her uncontested custody or control of the house. Daniel looked up. His voice was calm. Then we don't just defend. We attack. The plan came together in deliberate strokes. First, documentation. Every bank statement, every email, every access log needed to be admissible. Harris worked late into the night authenticating files, building a chain of custody airtight enough to withstand even the sharpest defense attorney. Second, timing. Leona insisted they stage the confrontation inside her office. Neutral ground. Formal. A setting that demanded composure, but one where Daniel could control the tempo. Third, exposure. Not everything needed to be revealed at once. The trick was to bait Ethan and Claire into lying first, then produce proof that shredded their credibility. Judges remember the moment someone's story collapses, Leona said. That's what sticks. Finally, leverage. Daniel didn't want violence. He didn't want shouting matches. He wanted to win where they thought they were strongest, on paper, in contracts, in the systems they believed belonged to them. I won't fight her physically, Daniel said, repeating his vow. His hand rested unconsciously on the scar beneath his shirt. But I'll win in ways she doesn't expect. Leona's sharp smile returned. Then let's give them their stage. The days leading up to the confrontation were heavy with tension. Daniel tried to keep life steady for Luke, but his son's quiet watchfulness told him the boy knew something was wrong. Meals together were shorter, conversations cautious. One evening, Daniel found Luke lingering in the doorway of the apartment. You and Mom, Luke started, then stopped. It's really over, isn't it? Daniel looked at his son, searching for words that wouldn't break him further. Your mom and we're on different paths now. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm your father. That will never change. Luke nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He didn't press further, but the question lingered in his eyes. Then, why does it feel like she's winning? 2 nights before the scheduled meeting, Harris arrived with one final envelope. This seals it, he said, dropping it on the table. Inside were screenshots from Ethan's encrypted messaging account, decrypted through a vulnerability Harris had exploited. The messages were chilling in their simplicity. Once the transfer clears, we move fast. He's still weak. He won't contest. Custody first. Assets after. He won't see it coming. Daniel read each line carefully. Then he set the pages down and exhaled. They think I'm too weak to fight. Then show them otherwise, Harris said. That night, Daniel stood alone in the dark of his apartment, city lights flickering through half-closed blinds. He lifted his shirt, fingertips tracing the scar again. Not in despair this time, but in resolve. He whispered to himself, this scar was supposed to be her freedom. Instead, it's my reminder. He tightened his grip, feeling the ache surge through him. You took my kidney. You took my trust. But you won't take my son. And you won't erase me. The next day, as Leona finalized the binders for court, Daniel returned to the apartment to find Luke sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale. A stack of papers lay in front of him, documents Daniel had left out by mistake. Luke's voice was quiet, but each word hit like a hammer. I heard Mom on the phone. With him. She said once they sell the house, once the custody hearing goes through, you'll be gone. Like you never existed. Daniel's chest tightened. He opened his mouth, but Luke pressed on, his eyes burning. Dad, are you just going to let her erase you? The question cut deeper than any betrayal. Not just because it was true, but because it came from the one person Daniel had sworn never to fail. He placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. No, Daniel said firmly. I'm not. For weeks, Claire and Ethan had believed they held all the cards. But now, with evidence stacked, allies by his side, and his own son demanding a fight, Daniel Harper was ready to spring the trap. The confrontation was coming, and for the first time, it would be on his terms. The conference room felt colder than usual. Gleaming surfaces, sharp edges, and the faint hum of an air vent gave the air a sterile, almost judicial atmosphere. That was intentional. Leona Fisk knew the room mattered. The setting made people careful with their words. Careful words, when paired with evidence, could dismantle an entire facade. Daniel sat at one end of the table, posture straight despite the lingering ache in his abdomen. At his side, Leona, sharp as ever, a binder open in front of her. Across from them, Claire sat stiff-backed in a tailored navy dress, her eyes cool but betraying flickers of unease. Beside her lounged Ethan Ward, all false confidence and polished charm, the kind of man who mistook charm for control. A third figure entered moments later, a mediator appointed by the court, neutral in theory but invested in truth. She set her notepad on the table and gestured for the parties to begin. Rutherford, Claire's attorney, started first. He leaned forward with an air of indignation. "My client seeks clarity and closure. Mr. Harper's interference with joint accounts has caused unnecessary hardship. He is unstable, still recovering from major surgery, and unable to provide consistent support for their son. We request immediate access to marital assets and temporary custody arrangements in the best interest of the child." Daniel didn't flinch. He let the words hang, waited for the echo of unstable to fade. Then he glanced at Leona. "Ms. Fisk," the mediator prompted. Leona stood, calm and deliberate. "We welcome clarity. But let's be precise. What's at issue today is not instability. It's betrayal, conspiracy, and fraud." She opened the binder with a sharp snap. "And we have evidence." Ethan smirked. "Evidence of what? That two people fell in love after a marriage had already died? That's hardly illegal." Leona slid a packet across the table. "Emails," she said simply, "between Mr. Ward and Mrs. Harper. Dated 6 weeks before Mr. Harper's surgery. Lines discussing survivorship rights and trust protections." The mediator leaned forward, scanning. Her brow furrowed. Daniel spoke for the first time, voice quiet but cutting. "While I was preparing to give her my kidney, they were planning what would happen after." Claire shifted in her seat. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. Ethan scoffed, but his eyes flickered toward Claire. Leona turned another page. "Bank transfers. 2 months pre-op, Mrs. Harper opened a separate account. Deposits traced back to shell companies tied to Ethan Ward. Funds later used for personal expenses, including jewelry and travel. That's marital misconduct. And fraud." She slid the statements toward the mediator. The woman adjusted her glasses, studying the pages carefully. "These deposits aren't small," she said. "And they were concealed from Mr. Harper?" "Correct," Leona confirmed. Rutherford began to object, but Leona cut him off with a sharp glance. "Don't bother with theatrics. These records come directly from the institutions. The numbers don't lie." Daniel added, his voice steady. "She wasn't just leaving me. She was funding her exit with money we both earned." Finally, Leona placed one last folder on the table. "This is perhaps the most damning," she said. "Medical notes and messages. Claire Harper pressed her husband to proceed with surgery despite knowing she had already initiated separation plans. She assured him the transplant would bring them closer. In reality, it freed her to leave." The mediator's face hardened as she read. So while he was offering his body to save her life, she was already preparing divorce filings? Daniel pulled his shirt slightly aside, exposing the edge of the scar. "That scar isn't just a wound. It's proof I gave her life while she was planning to erase mine." The room fell silent. Even Rutherford shifted uncomfortably, the force of the evidence undeniable. At that moment, the door opened. A new figure entered, Agent Donovan, financial crimes investigator with the state. His badge flashed briefly as he introduced himself. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, voice crisp. "But my office has been reviewing certain transfers involving Mr. Ward. Several match the description of fraud under federal statutes." Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. "This is absurd." Agent Donovan held up a hand. "Mr. Ward, we have records of you moving funds from client trusts into accounts later tied to personal expenses. You've done this before in other cases. What you've attempted here is not new. And now it's documented. Claire's eyes widened, her face draining of color. She looked from Ethan to the agent, realization dawning that the man she'd trusted might drag her into something far bigger than a divorce. Ethan straightened, trying to recover. This is a witch hunt. Claire and you, Leona interrupted smoothly, conspired while Daniel was in a hospital bed. You took advantage of his vulnerability, of her desperation, and of your position at the hospital. That's not love, Mr. Ward. That's exploitation. The mediator closed her folder. I've heard enough for today. Mr. Harper's injunction stands. No assets may be moved until the court reviews this new evidence. And custody will remain joint pending further hearings. Daniel finally leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Claire. You wanted to erase me. But you forgot one thing. I'm still here. Claire's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Ethan's jaw tightened, fury flickering behind his polished mask. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel gathered his papers. He had expected anger, denial, maybe even tears. Instead, he saw something else in Claire's eyes, a flicker of fear. Outside in the hallway, he felt a tug on his sleeve. Luke stood there, face pale, having overheard enough to piece the story together. His voice shook, but his words carried the weight of truth. Dad, you gave her everything. And she tried to erase you. Are you just going to let her? Daniel placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. No, son. Not now. Not ever. The trap had sprung. But the reckoning was only beginning. The weeks that followed the confrontation moved quickly, though for Daniel Harper each day felt weighted with decades of consequence. When the divorce decree finally arrived, it was not the coffin nail Claire had once planned. It was a verdict that bore his fingerprints, his resolve, his refusal to be erased. Joint custody was secured. Luke would spend equal time with both parents, no emergency motions, no rushed removals. The court had been clear. Daniel was not unstable, not incapable, not unfit. He was a father who had sacrificed more than most men ever would, and the record showed it. The house in Northcrest, once at the center of Claire and Ethan's plans, was frozen by injunction. Ethan's name was scrubbed from every document. Claire received her share of marital assets but not the lion's portion she'd envisioned. Every attempt to conceal transfers or redirect funds had been exposed, each one documented in black and white. The affair was on the record. The mediator's notes carried the evidence of emails and timestamps, the photos Harris had taken, the transfers traced back to Ethan's shell companies. Claire could not spin the story into a narrative of love after loss. The paper trail told the truth, betrayal layered on deception. Ethan Ward's collapse was swift and brutal. The hospital, upon receiving Harris's file, launched an internal review. Within a week, Ethan was placed on administrative leave. Within 2, his ID badge was disabled, his office cleared out under the watch of security. Colleagues who once nodded in admiration now whispered in hallways, their tones clipped with disgust. The state medical board opened an inquiry into ethics violations, fraternizing with a patient, breaching confidentiality, and leveraging his position for financial gain. Even before the case concluded, Ethan's reputation was scorched. Invitations vanished, contracts dissolved. The man who once thrived on proximity to power now found doors locked, his name a cautionary tale in professional circles. For Daniel, it was not triumph in the traditional sense. Ethan's downfall did not restore what was lost. But it ended the illusion that Ethan was untouchable. It marked a line in the sand. You cannot build a future on another man's sacrifice without consequence. Claire signed the final papers with the detachment of someone who had already moved into regret. She did not apologize, at least not to Daniel. But her shoulders seemed smaller, her voice quieter, her presence less commanding. She lived in a modest condo now, far from the grandeur she and Ethan once plotted. The circles she'd cultivated no longer welcomed her. Invitations dried up, whispers spread. Whatever status she thought Ethan had offered her, it vanished the moment his mask slipped. Daniel did not gloat. He did not need to. The evidence had spoken. Life itself had delivered the verdict. Physically, Daniel's body still carried reminders of his ordeal. The scar ached on cold mornings. Fatigue lingered in his muscles. But each week brought strength. He started walking longer distances, first around the block, then to the park, then back into a modest routine of exercise. Emotionally, the progress was slower but no less steady. He stopped replaying the emails at night. He stopped hearing Ethan's words in his head. The anger remained, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled his commitment to rebuild, not for revenge, but for Luke, for himself, for the life that still stretched forward. He returned to work part-time, his colleagues careful at first, then welcoming as they saw the steadiness in him return. He was no longer just the man who had been betrayed, he was Daniel again, measured, dependable, stronger than they had ever realized. The new house wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. A 3-bedroom place on the edge of town, close enough for Luke's school commute and quiet enough to feel like sanctuary. The first weekend the kids visited, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Luke explored every corner, testing doors, checking the backyard, finally claiming the largest bedroom as his own. His laughter echoed through the halls, filling the empty space with life. His daughter, quieter, carried her backpack into the smaller room and pinned a few photos to the corkboard Daniel had hung in advance. She studied the walls like she was measuring whether they could hold her secrets. Daniel gave her space, and slowly she relaxed into the rhythm of the new house. They ate pizza at the kitchen table, boxes spread open, sodas fizzing. Luke cracked jokes about how Dad's place needs posters, and promised to help him decorate. His daughter smiled softly, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her in months. When the night settled and the kids tucked into their new rooms, Daniel stepped outside onto the back deck. The cool evening air carried the sounds of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. For the first time in a long time, silence felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Daniel stood beneath the stars, one hand resting unconsciously on his scar. He thought of everything the wound had represented: sacrifice, betrayal, loss. But now, in this place, it meant something else. It meant survival. It meant endurance. He whispered into the quiet, more to himself than anyone else. For the first time since the surgery, I feel whole again. The words didn't erase the past, but they acknowledged something more important: the future. Inside, laughter drifted down the hall. Luke and his sister arguing playfully about who got the bigger closet. Daniel smiled, stepped back inside, and closed the door. The war was over. The rebuilding had begun. 6 months passed. Time did not erase the scars, but it reshaped them. The court filings, the confrontation, the late nights surrounded by binders and photographs, all of it now sat in Daniel Harper's rearview. The storm had passed, leaving behind clearer skies and steadier ground. Claire's marriage to Ethan had dissolved faster than anyone expected. The scandal of his investigation had followed him everywhere, into the hospital halls, into courtrooms, into the whispers of neighbors who had once admired his tailored suits. With his license suspended and his accounts under review, Ethan had no more gifts to offer, no more doors to open. The status that had once drawn Claire like a moth to light now scorched her. Their partnership, built on secrecy and stolen time, collapsed under the weight of exposure. Within months, she filed to separate from him as well. Claire now lived quietly, her social circle fractured, her reputation tainted. She had the life she'd chosen, but not the one she imagined. For Ethan, the fall was merciless. Professional hearings stripped him of his position. His name circulated in headlines, not as a rising figure in the transplant program, but as a man who manipulated patients, breached ethics, and siphoned money through shadow accounts. He faced civil suits from more than one family, each claiming financial damages tied to his schemes. Whatever charm once paved his way now rang hollow. Daniel didn't need to lift a finger. The truth had been enough. And Daniel? He was thriving. The logistics manager who once measured his worth in quiet reliability now stood at the helm of his own consulting business. Companies sought him for his precision, his steadiness, the same qualities that once made Claire yawn but now made him indispensable in high-pressure industries. More importantly, his relationship with his children deepened. Luke spent weekends at his new house, often sprawled across the couch with textbooks or lacrosse gear, confident his father would be in the stands. His daughter, once hesitant, now left sketches taped to the fridge, her laughter filling the quiet spaces. The new home carried their fingerprints, posters on walls, sneakers by the door, pizza boxes from nights spent together. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was theirs. One Saturday morning, while jogging through the park, Daniel paused at a booth set up for a kidney health awareness event. Volunteers handed out pamphlets, encouraging people to register as donors. He stood there longer than expected, the scar beneath his shirt tingling like it remembered. When one of the organizers recognized him, "You're Daniel Harper, right? We heard what you did for your wife." He didn't flinch. He smiled faintly, nodded, and asked how he could help. Maybe it was time to give his story purpose. Not as a man who was betrayed, but as someone who could guide others through the fear and uncertainty of transplant decisions. And when friends encouraged him to start dating again, he didn't laugh it off the way he once had. He wasn't rushing into anything, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine the possibility of someone new. Someone who valued the things he brought, not what he lacked. One evening, after dropping the kids at their mother's condo, Daniel sat on his deck, a glass of water in hand, stars overhead. He traced the scar absent-mindedly and reflected on everything that had happened. "In the end," he whispered, voice calm but resolute, "I gave her life. She tried to take mine apart. But some betrayals only prove one thing: you're stronger without them." The scar no longer burned. It no longer pulled at him like a wound. It was simply there, a reminder of survival, of choices, of clarity. As the story of Daniel Harper closes, another begins. Betrayal never ends the way its authors plan. It always leaves truth in its wake. If you want another story where betrayal meets justice, subscribe for more. Because every scar carries a story. And every story deserves to be told.